Could Arizona be the first U.S. state to pass a strategic Bitcoin reserve? It sure looks like it. Arizona jumps into first and second place in the race to get an SBR bill out and on the governor's desk. We talk about it. We talk about all the states, where they are, and how the race is heating up this May. Bitcoin Season 2 is brought to you by Arch Network, the platform building bridgeless apps on Bitcoin. More on Arch later on the show. Let's kick it off. Arizona jumps into first place. The checkered flag has been waved, Colin, and Arizona screams past on the final lap. Arizona passes 2 bills, and all they have to do is be signed by the governor, and then Arizona can hold and buy Bitcoin and other digital assets. We are actually, it's going to happen by this point. It's actually going to happen.
Do you think so? There's not going to be a veto by Arizona's governor? Well, this is something you wrote about in the newsletter for this week, was that it's not a guarantee, because to get that signature would mean the Democratic governor of Arizona would have to side with an expressively conservative bill. I mean, it doesn't have to be, but at this point, Bitcoin is pretty right-coded according to a lot of people, you know?
When I say it's going to happen, I'm talking about, like, we've got now multiple states, like, closing in on the finish line, the final lap. So, like, you've got to think that one of these is going to work. And for the listener who's not in the weeds, Colin and I will explain. We'll explain what the current lineup is, who's in the lead, and explain some of the details around why a state, say like Texas, has 3 simultaneous strategic Bitcoin reserve bills currently going through, and why Arizona is currently in the lead. As we record this on Thursday, May 1st, we have in the final vote in the, I believe, House of New Hampshire, another SBR, which is favorable to pass. So, like, we are now going to possibly get multiple of these bills on governors' desks this May to see if they'll sign or not. Colin, how do you want to start breaking this down for the listener?
Yeah, so I think that let's just hop into where the current landscape stands. And just a quick correction for the New Hampshire bill. It passed in committee in the Senate, and it will be put to a vote in the Senate because it's a House bill, so it originated there. And I don't know whether or not people are hopeful this one will pass. Doesn't seem like there is too much opposition to it. But perhaps to start, we could just pull up this nifty little tracker from our friends at Bitcoin Laws. Shout out to the guys building that. And we will take a look at where the current race stands. So as Charlie mentioned, Arizona in first and second place with 2 bills that originated in the Senate that passed via the House most recently. And now all they have to get is a signature from the governor. One of these probably will die. The other one will take its place. At least I think. Someone could probably correct me who's more informed on political matters, but it seems kind of redundant to have 2 of these bills exist.
Well,
but go ahead.
I can actually, if you want to, I can explain the distinguishing between these 2 bills in Arizona. So
I think that's important because there are a few differences between them. The most interesting thing to me, though, is that it allows for a pretty aggressive allocation to Bitcoin. It's on the higher end in terms of what states are proposing for their strategic Bitcoin reserve in terms of total percentage of public funding for something like this.
Yeah. A general observation is, like, most of the language of most of these bills is actually pretty gracious. Like, we see a common, like, denomination of an up to 10% of, like, various large, like, components of treasuries. So it's really interesting because you see BlackRock, you see Larry Fink saying you should probably have like 1 to 2% of your portfolio allocated towards Bitcoin, and yet we see the most conservative capital allocators, the states themselves, the governments, like possibly be looking to like put a head limit on around 10%. Okay, so Arizona, we have 2 bills, and it's actually pretty simple to make this analogy. Just like at the national level, you have the strategic stockpile, which is what the executive order that Trump signed, which prevented the U.S. government from selling any seized assets. That is what one of the Arizona bills would accomplish. Basically, it says the seized assets or confiscated assets, digital assets, those can be put into a special fund, which is allocated as more of an investment, versus the active strategy, which you might compare to the Cynthia Lummis bill, which would be we're going to allow the state to buy Bitcoin, similar to how Cynthia Lummis and her bill would allow the US government to actively buy and acquire Bitcoin. So those are the two bills that both passed in Arizona this past week. And they both passed not by really a narrow margin, but, a decent margin. And in the case of one of them, this was Senate Bill 1025. It passed 31 to 25 with 4 not voting. If we go back to our how a bill becomes a law, little cartoon, demonstration that you would watch back in middle school.
Schoolhouse Rock, Bitcoin edition.
Rock. Yeah. So the bill, they argue about it, goes through a process, but then it's got to be signed. And this is the one, as you did push back. Arizona's a little unique because there is tension, really not just tension. It's just basically a brawl, between the governor and the Democratic governor and the largely Republican denominated legislature. As I'm not super in the weeds, I understand she could just veto one or both of these bills or just not sign them. And that's kind of, but that's all that stands in between these being enacted.
Katie Hobbs is the governor of Arizona, and she's a member of the Democratic Party. TBD whether or not she actually wants to veto this. I mean, it's pretty rare that a governor or a president will outright veto a bill if it's passed both chambers, right?
Yeah.
But it could happen. I want to revert back to some of the distinguishing factors between these two, to your point, Charlie, because I think this is really interesting. Both of the Arizona bills allow for up to 10% allocation in Bitcoin secured in a custodian or through an exchange traded product. But both of them, as far as I can tell from reading the description, have kind of two key differentiators that are unique to both. So for the one, like you said, it allows for seized Bitcoin and civil asset forfeiture, things of that nature, to be subsumed within that reserve, but also includes that 10% stipulation where it says here, the state treasurer is limited to investing no more than 10% of the fund's total monies in any fiscal year and may loan digital assets to generate additional returns if no financial risks are increased. This is another interesting thing. A lot of these bills include clauses where the treasurer can actually use these Bitcoins for yield, whatever that may be. They can lend them out into the private market or however else they're going to generate yield from that. The other one, so that is Senate Bill 1373 in Arizona. The other one, Senate Bill 1025, includes that 10% stipulation. Let me see. And I'm trying to see if it doesn't have a clause for lending the Bitcoin out. But one of the things that I do find interesting is it stipulates that if the federal government passes a similar reserve, then Arizona may be allowed or will be allowed to store their Bitcoin in the federal government via the Treasury, which like the anti-federalist in me, the ghost of Thomas Jefferson is looming over this conversation. I find that to be kind of interesting because, it makes sense from a de-risking the whole position standpoint. I would personally rather probably have a custodian who knows what they're doing to hold my funds, like a professional, maybe like a Bitwise or something like that, right? Or a Coinbase. But I find that clause interesting because to me, one of the benefits for the state as well is to have, if we're really game theorizing this, right, and looking at Bitcoin as a digital bearer asset that is highly inconfiscatable if you store it correctly, I don't know why you would give your keys to the king, right? And to me, it seems like you would be better suited as a state, especially in a highly polarized political environment, to hold your Bitcoin yourself rather than to relinquish the keys to the treasury. But
or I mean, like this is also this is a sliding scale of counterparty trust assumptions. Like, sorry, Coinbase, I don't think it would, like we're talking about, it might not make sense to put your Bitcoin alongside everyone else who's been custodying at Coinbase, the BlackRocks, the MicroStrategies, everybody. Maybe you go for an Anchor Watch, who I had Rob on the show on a couple months ago. But Anchor Watch, it's an interesting signing scheme where you can like have incremental counterparty signers for things, and it's you have a little more control over how your stuff is custodian. But it's interesting because, like, I mean, these are U.S. states, like these are entities with lots of resources. Why don't they just do it themselves? Like, the whole purpose of these is to accomplish like states having a little bit more autonomy. Like, for their other treasury assets, they tend to prefer to have certain levels of control over those as well. Why wouldn't it also be with their Bitcoin? I do like this idea, though, Colin. You brought up that they can go pursue. One of these bills has language that they can go to pursue like yield or something. I'm imagining like the state of Arizona wrapping like their Bitcoin, getting wrapped Bitcoin on like ETH and doing like DeFi lending shenanigans, and maybe like blowing out the APYs of some of these other DeFi protocols.
Yeah, like wrapping their Bitcoin and then yield farming PP token.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so eventually,
honestly, like the Fartcoin got blown out because the state of Arizona bought a bunch of the governance token with their state treasury. And
imagine how much the state of Arizona could fund all of their pension plans if they had just aped into Fartcoin a year or two ago.
Let me tell you about one of the most slept on opportunities in crypto. Arch is building fast, composable DeFi apps on Bitcoin. Arch apps tap into the OG blockchain with by far the most liquidity and best brand in crypto. I've known the team for over a year. The tech they're building is solid, and they are racing towards mainnet. There's dexes like Saturn, meme coins on FunkyBit.fun, instant loans on Cha-Ching, and so much more. Plus, they're rewarding testnet users, so join me in trying out Arch while it's still early.
Going back to the custody thing, Anchor Watch is great, also insured by Lloyd's of London up to a certain point, depending on your plan. Obviously, something like that would be good, especially if it's a company that is, let's say, a little closer to the Bitcoin cyberpunk ethos, or just generally kind of good actors. I do think when you're asking, like, why do states not just do that themselves? I feel like governments are very keen to just offload any responsibility like this onto professionals in the private sector, because it's either a combination of laziness or just kind of humility, saying this isn't really our domain. Why don't we just contract someone out for this? But then there's the other scenario where they decide to not go with a custodian, and the treasurer of the state of Arizona is sleeping with a cold card under his mattress or something like that. Or you have some sort of, I'm imagining all of these harebrained schemes where it's like you have maybe like 4 different representatives who memorize 3 words of a seed phrase each.
That's called multi-party computations. MPC, we split the seed up.
Anyway, all that being said, that I think that's kind of an unanswered piece to this, or an unexplored part of this, and an unknown until one of these passes. It will be really interesting. And I think you're right. We will get at least one bill that is enacted into law. And it will be fascinating to see which states decide to custody with certain custodians, or which states decide to take self-custody. If the United States government ends up actually passing an active Bitcoin reserve, if they will decide to relinquish their keys to the treasury for safekeeping. There are so many different ways that they could skin this cat, and I think it'll be interesting and really telling the ways in which they decide to go with it. I would imagine that a lot of custodians would probably be chomping at the bit for a government contract like this. Maybe not from Arizona as much as like a Texas or a California that have massive GDPs, right? But business is business, right? So it's ripe for the spoils. Should we move on to? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, let's move on. So we just for the listener, for context, this Bitcoin laws tracks 40 bills in the SBR class, 40 SBR type bills having been filed from U.S. states over the past year. Some of these were filed last legislative session. Most are currently in the current active legislative session. Of those 40 bills, 6 are dead, and multiple are duplicates in the case of North Carolina, Ohio, Montana, Missouri, Iowa, and Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and Arizona. And in one case, there's 3 bills, and that's in Texas. We'll talk about that. Which state do you want to go to next, Colin?
I think let's give a quick overview of the ones that are just neck and neck with Arizona.
Yeah.
So we already mentioned, and I'm going to confirm this right now by looking on the website, the New Hampshire bill. Yes, the New Hampshire bill will be taken to the Senate floor today. So we should know probably within the day whether or not that one is going to pass both chambers and then go to the governor's desk for a signature. There's also the North Carolina bill where it passed its first reading in the Senate, and now it has been referred to the Committee on Rules and Operations of the Senate, if I'm reading this correctly. TBD when there will be an actual vote on that. I'm not totally certain what the legislative process is for North Carolina, but it passed its second reading in the House just yesterday. So I assume maybe if we are looking at the House and the Senate of North Carolina having similar processes, and there's probably someone who's more legally informed than I am, who's that's not how this works, but maybe it has to have 2 readings in the Senate. But needless to say, this one should have a resolution, or we should have more clarity on it sometime soon. And then let's move on to the Texas bill, per what you were saying, Charlie, because this is the other one that is kind of neck and neck with Arizona. Outside of the Arizona bills, there's a North Carolina bill from the House, there's a New Hampshire bill, and there's a Texas bill from the Senate that are close in the sense of if they pass their next reading and they end up getting voted in, then they will go to the governor's desk for a vote. And the Texas bill that we have currently here, and let me just read the update on it. The last action item on the Texas website, on the government of the Texas legislature website, is that it was left pending in committee on 4/23. It passed its vote in the Senate, but it's sitting in committee, and I'm not totally sure whether or not it will advance to the second chamber. That one's kind of up in the air. But Charlie, maybe you can give us a quick rundown on this bill, because as you said, there are 3 in Texas, and they're all pretty different.
What's notable about this particular bill, which is the favored one for Texas, of the 3, is, I'll just first say that it's that the 3 sponsors, no, there's 4 sponsors of the bill. Charles Schwertner is the primary sponsor, and there's 3 co-sponsors, and it is bipartisan. So 3 R's and 1 D sponsoring this, which is great. You do love to see some bipartisan support for these, which is usually a good sign. Given that anything bipartisan, seems incrementally more likely of being successful. So, this Senate bill 21, this particular bill is interesting because instead of saying you can allocate part of your treasury, as many of the other bills and languages do, this bill actually creates a whole new fund outside of the treasury with a lot more powers and flexibility on the investment side. And it's controlled by the comptroller and a 5-member, quote, expert advisory committee from reps in the private Bitcoin and crypto sector. So this is interesting because this allows Texas to kind of operate almost like a liquid fund, like a liquid venture fund, in how it's structured. And it, so those of us who are in Bitcoin, like we go, oh yeah, it's probably the more optimal way to do it, I guess. But at the same time, like this would represent a more active role as opposed to like defensive role that I think the language is positioning a lot of these state bills in. So this would be more like Texas gets to operate like multi-coin than, which is also headquartered in Austin, Texas, by the way, and more like multi-coin than an actual like strategic reserve. So that's a very interesting kind of like dimension of this Senate Bill 21 in Texas.
Is that a contention with the provision that the cryptocurrency invested in has to have a $500 billion market cap?
I don't know. My head is swimming from trying to read through all these bills, but the summary on Bitcoin laws does have Senate Bill 21 in Texas as the 500 billion minimum market cap, which for the listener would mean that only Bitcoin qualifies to be invested in.
It's an interesting provision because what that essentially does is it guarantees that you're only going to get the cream of the crop outright, right? But it opens up the potential in the future to invest in other crypto assets should they transcend that barrier. I think it's pretty smart and prudent because what it's basically saying is we're going to do Bitcoin first because that's the only one that meets this requirement. It's the least risky of all of the cryptocurrencies. And if people are uncomfortable with some of those other ones, then if they end up passing that $500 million market cap, then maybe the risk or the perceived risk is lowered in people's eyes. I think that's pretty judicious wording on the part of the legislators who draft this bill.
Yeah, it's great because, it's hard. These bills have to be like asset neutral. Bitcoin only bills, as much as I'd love them because I'm a Bitcoiner, it's just the kind of thing like you have to have as neutral language as possible. And the way you can get an effectively Bitcoin only bill, and it actually demonstrates like a good like rule of thumb high watermark for these assets. They just have to be big enough. And it's also just generally good from a treasury standpoint. You don't want to be investing in illiquid small cap shitcoins. We don't want, as much as I joke about it, we don't want Texas buying Farcoin. We want them buying Bitcoin so that us Bitcoiners can roll some of our profits into Farcoin. That's the whole point.
And the original bill that was proposed in Texas, I believe this was the first one, or it was one of the first, was pretty underwhelming when you consider the actual text of the bill. What it originally stated was that the government of Texas could accept donations in Bitcoin, and it would allow Texas to hold Bitcoin, effectively establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve. But it didn't originally stipulate that the government could actually actively purchase Bitcoin. I believe it was amended later. And now, I quote from Bitcoin laws, the bill limits Bitcoin purchases to no more than 1% of the unencumbered general revenue fund balance per biennial cycle and requires the comptroller to produce a biennial report detailing the reserve's total Bitcoin holdings. Now, compare that again to the Arizona bill, which allows up to 10% of the fund that is allocated towards buying Bitcoin. 1%, I mean, again, Texas versus Arizona. Texas has a much larger GDP, so maybe this is a larger slice of the pie, but it's still a much more conservative allocation when you factor in what percentage of the state budget is going towards something like Bitcoin. And we could probably go on and on for an entire other episode dissecting the differences between all of these.
Yeah.
But it's just funny considering Texas has been one of the lodestars of many a Bitcoin business, right? Whether that be a company like Unchained, I believe they're headquartered in Austin, or it's
a lot of people in Austin, a lot of miners in Austin, a lot of finance,
Bitcoin miner. Like Texas is the heart of the Bitcoin mining industry in the U.S., and they have one of the more conservative bills. But that's not the one that's currently advancing through the Senate. Maybe that there's some signal there.
Well, yeah, I mean, because Texas, as I talk to Texans and people in the space, you look at the Texas Blockchain Council, which is led, pretty much acted almost more like a national organization, national leader in the like advocacy for domestic embrasure of digital assets in the U.S. Like even then, even though Texas is kind of this titan in both industry and policy, it's like the state is like not fully sold on it from a legislator standpoint. Like I understand it's like still a lot of this is still pretty contentious, and you have issues like you have simultaneously like a whole kind of challenge with Bitcoin miners both helping the grid and creating a lot of problems and getting a lot of pushback in their respective judicial or in districts. So the next one that we can talk about is an interesting dynamic where we have Alabama here, who has two bills, basically identical language, and each bill, one is starting in the House and one is starting in the Senate. So they're pretty much identical bills, sponsored by a senator and a House rep, and they start in one of the houses. And the strategy is to basically increase the likelihood that one or both of these would pass. Because the way the process works, you start in one of the in either the House or Senate, and then you go to the other. And so sometimes if you just present more opportunities for people to vote and talk about it, it increases your hits on target. So I was not aware that this is like a strategy. Maybe this is common in government and bureaucracy. This seems, again, kind of hilarious and inefficient. But you see this meta emerge in Alabama. Both of these are in committee for House and Senate in their respective sides of the legislature.
Yeah, and a lot of bills currently in committee. So I think that there will be many fruits for discussion over the next few months as some of these advance or get killed. Charlie, maybe we can close on some of the ones that have failed. We can focus specifically on one from your home state, the beautiful Oklahoma, and then also touch on Pennsylvania to show kind of two different ways in which some of these bills are getting struck down.
Yeah, so I can offer a look behind the curtain. I think I talked a bit about it on previous episodes of Bitcoin Season 2, but I'm in Oklahoma. I'm on the board of the Oklahoma Bitcoin Association, and we were pushing the SBR in Oklahoma, and it looked like a lot of these. It was just take some of the state treasury, put it into an asset like Bitcoin, got to be over 500 billion. And some language about like what you can do, what stable coins are okay to touch, that kind of thing. Well, the bill passed overwhelmingly in the House, and then it went. Then it was going on to the Senate, and before it goes to the Senate, it's got to go to a Senate committee. In this case, it went to the Revenue and Taxation Committee in the Senate, where the chair of that committee is also head of the Senate. He's works, for banks, and members of the Oklahoma Bitcoin Association had done a lot of legwork, talking to all the members of this committee, explaining how it worked, talking to them, getting a feel for what we thought the vote might go. Our lobbyists are talking to them. We all felt pretty confident about it, which is great because we were a little uncertain. We were kind of maybe 50% that it would actually pass a Senate vote. But as it was going through committee and as more states around the U.S. start adding these bills, we began to feel more confident. So the week of that it was in committee, we were pretty confident that it actually passed committee overwhelmingly. But as it would happen, that same week, even though we touched base with many of the members of this committee, you had other senators like hold special meetings advocating against this specific bill. The language was that this is very similar to the internet boom of the 2000s. That this is kind of like, again, it's a bubble. It's the same kind of arguments you've heard a million times before. And we had several yeses switched to nos. What's interesting, and the bill failed in committee 6-5, unfortunately. What's funny is we actually had a no switch to yes, because somebody from like one of our local meetups called their senator and was like, "Hey, you're in committee for this," and so they actually switched a single call, switched a no from a yes. So it actually would have been 7-5, because there was such coordinated campaigning against this that we were not aware of it, just because it kind of happened. I mean, you don't know what you don't know, and it's like so much work to follow every single meeting and every single conversation that's happening. And this is the kind of like dynamic. This is what it looks like from a tactical view of like how these bills go and get into law. So it's not like everyone is on Twitter and they browse through and they go, "Oh, look, Dennis Porter's retweeting that Arizona's about to buy Bitcoin. That seems like a great idea." No, they don't evaluate there's not a whole lot of like real evaluation of the language of these bills. It's really just how they feel about it. This is quite frankly, it's just how they feel about it. It's about vibe, and it's about does it augment their chances for a re-election next year?
Vibe voting. And it's a good example again of the ways in which senators and Congress members, both on the federal and state level, are pulled in so many different directions. It's like they're being quartered every day by different political interests and business interests. And the fact of the matter is their staffers end up doing most of the legwork to figure out the details of specific bills or policy, and lobbying rules how they view that. And lobbyists are always at their ear. And so all of these bills obviously have had many champions and many detractors. And sometimes, as with the Oklahoma bill, the chips don't fall in the favor of those who would like to see a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And the Oklahoma one is a good example of one that failed in committee. People were pretty hopeful about it, as were you, Charlie. And obviously, it's not going to materialize now. There's another one, and we'll close on this because it shows kind of the opposite end of the spectrum of, a baby that was, smothered in the cradle, so to speak. There was a bill from Pennsylvania that was, I believe, one of the first ones for a strategic Bitcoin reserve to be introduced. It was introduced by one Michael Cable last year, right before the election, I think in October.
And it was a good bill.
It was a good bill. It would have allowed for investing up to 10% of key state funds, including the general fund, budget stabilization fund, and others under the treasurer. But Representative Cable did not get reelected. And if you sponsor a bill and you don't get reelected, your bill is done. And that one was shoved to the wayside pretty quickly after he lost his seat last election. Many ways for these to fail, few ways for them to succeed. So just needless to say, should we get one of these or a few of them, I think it'll be a massive win for those who have been pushing for these bills, because it's really hard to get something like this passed. I mean, most of these states are worried about employment, cost of living, a host of other issues that were front and center during the election cycle last year. Honestly, Bitcoin is probably the last thing on their mind, and the fact that these have advanced to the state that they have is pretty impressive in its own right.
Yep. But as we know in Bitcoin, things happen really fast. So I will be doing a little informal tracking of how much the state of Oklahoma would have made or lost on what an expected investment size would be. So I'll be doing this quarterly. I'll be making sure to tag the relevant senators and people who voted for and against it, just so they can get updates, because sure would, be nice to be able to have some actual real back testing data next legislative session in 2026, when we represent perhaps a similar SBR type bill with updated language for the modern era of next year.
You've heard of the Oracle of Omaha, but you've not heard of the Oracle of Oklahoma, and he is going to keep tabs and receipts on all of the money that Oklahoma could have won or lost.
Yep. So anyway, that is the states. If you're listening to this, we write about this topic a lot. We cover the SBR story. We cover how the U.S. Important beats in Bitcoin and crypto in the U.S. in our newsletter. So make sure to check out blockspace.media for more deep dives on our newsletter. And other than that, Paul and I will see you all next week for Writer's Room. I don't know what we're going to talk about, but if you have an opinion.
Oh, we know what we're going to talk about. Little teaser. There is blood in the streets. We are currently staring down another developer war in Bitcoin. Some people want to increase the op return limit. If you don't know what that is, don't worry. We will cover what it is next week, why some people love it, why others fear it, and will Bitcoin fork from this? Probably not, but for the sake of the episode, almost certainly.
Yeah, so we'll explain the boogeyman next week, and see you all later.